Okay, welcome. This is a work in progress, week after week. Let me remind you that we will not meet next week because of the food festival here. The room will be under construction, nor will we meet the week following the food festival, November the 4th, because this room will be a mess. We are hopeful we'll be back in business on November the 11th. So this will be our last one. We'll take a 2-week break. We'll have about 3 sessions, I think, in November, and if it plans out correctly, we probably will finish part 1 about the tree that got chosen before Thanksgiving. And then we'll begin seeing how the holidays plan out for us when we want to start part 2, the tree that wasn't chosen, and move into that then. So that gives you an idea of where we are and how we're moving along. So, excursus, culture wars and the coming darkness. Culture wars and the coming darkness. 50 years ago, on a tour of Europe, our tour was in Athens. And while we were in Athens, we took day trips out to other sites in Greece. While we were there, an optional day trip, an excursion to the island of Crete and the ruins of the Minoan civilization was offered. The excursion was an unexpected add-on. We had to pay extra for the round-trip flight to get to the island of Crete. Now, this was a 10-week tour, European tour, and I had budgeted my spending money, which did not include this newly added expense of an excursion to Crete. So I stayed behind in Athens and did not go. It was a day trip, not an overnighter. Had I known then that many years later I would be teaching ancient to medieval humanities at a university where I would be discussing at length the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, I might have made a different choice. Everything I talked about then was from pictures in a book rather than having been an eyewitness of it on the island myself. The point is this: when one is on a journey and a side trip excursion to a place you'll never have the opportunity to go and see again, if at all possible, you ought to take the trip. Well, at first glance, this excursion tonight has little to do with paradise and its 2 trees. But on second look, it is this excursion that reminds us of the relevance of our journey together and the existential consequences in this life of which tree we choose. There really is going to be a connection, but it will not be obvious or apparent maybe till we get into part 2. The Hollywood movie The Sting, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford back in 1973, tells the story of 2 con artists who created an elaborate betting room scam in which the target, the mark, is made to believe the betting room world is real and is enticed to bet an enormous amount of money on a one-time guaranteed opportunity to win a massive fortune. Of course, none of it is real. The target loses his money, and the 2 con artists have all the money at the end. The movie The Sting reminds us we need to know the game that is being played in the world we think we know. When we speak of cultures and civilizations, We speak of huge realities that often cover large geographical areas and have lasted for centuries, if not thousands of years. In other words, we can talk about Western culture, but we really don't know what we're talking about or meaning by that, and we need to look at it. We think we know, but if we're not careful, we end up being the victim in the sting where somebody has created a false world for us so they can con us out of the goods. What do we mean when we talk of a civilization? So therefore, I'm having to do a little bit of education this evening. For us to talk about the world we are living in tonight, to understand that it's bigger than 3 feet in front of us, it is larger than, and the issues at stake are larger than the issues of our own personal lives. And those issues are impacting us invisibly in ways we are unaware of. So what is a culture or what is a civilization? A civilization is a cultural entity. Villages have their own culture, regions have a culture, ethnic groups, nationalities, religious groups, all have a distinct value system, a culture, and that these are at different levels of a cultural heterogeneity, putting it all together, how it all fits. For example, the culture of a village in southern Italy may be different from that of a village in northern Italy. But both will share in a common Italian culture that distinguishes them from German villages. So in Italy, you may have one village in southern Italy and one in northern Italy, and they'll be different. They're Italian, and whatever they have in agreement of being Italian is going to be different from a village in Germany. European communities, in turn, will share cultural features that distinguish them from Arab or Chinese communities. Cultural differences. Arabs, Chinese, Westerners are not part of any larger cultural identity. We call these things civilizations. A civilization is thus the highest cultural grouping and the broadest level of cultural identity that people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species. And of course, we're in a world that even that distinction is now under attack. Our culture is defined by both common objective elements, such as language, history, religion, customs, institutions, and by the subjective identification of people themselves. People have levels of identity. For example, a resident in the city of Rome, did I not bring in my markers? I guess I didn't. Gail, are they out there? Let me read it and then we'll illustrate it on the board. A resident of the city of Rome may define himself or herself with varying degrees of intensity as a Roman, a city of Rome. Thanks, Gail. As a Roman, member of the city of Rome. I don't know how low I can get and you can still see, but I'm going to put Rome here. If you ask them, who are you? They could say, I'm a Roman. I'm I'm not a Venetian from the city of Venice, I'm from Rome. And then, if they went beyond that, they could have then said, I'm an Italian, as a larger identity of everybody that lives in Italy. And then you could have said beyond that, that I'm a Catholic. And being a Catholic would be a larger category than just being somebody from Italy. And then that would make a Catholic, you could identify them versus a Hindu, that makes them a Christian as a larger cultural identity and understanding. And then they could have said, I'm a European, as opposed to an Asian, as opposed to an American. I'm a European. And that would be a larger cultural identity that would give us information. And then they could say, I'm a Westerner. Westerner, as opposed to an Asian or an African. And so each one of these levels is a level that has its own culture. The culture of a city, we could start actually inside here and you could put your own home. Each home has its own identity that makes it different from the home of the neighbors. Even though you would have a commonality with neighbors in a neighborhood, that's you're getting the point of what a culture is. And so when we talk Western culture or we talk civilization, it's the biggest thing there is. You've got Asian cultures, African cultures, Western culture. The only thing larger than that is humanity versus animals. And that's even under debate today by some scientists, saying there's no difference between us and a pig in terms of value. In fact, with the wagon that turned over, the schooner that turned over at the OU football game, there's been more attention paid to whether the horses got hurt than whether the individual riders got hurt. What a world we live in. Cultural values is what we're talking about. The things we take for granted, the unexamined presuppositions that are part of how we think because we were raised in this area. I'm raised in Oklahoma and not New England. I'm raised in Oklahoma City and not Paris. There's a way of thinking that comes with where we are. Culture, therefore, represents the shared values shared in common by a group. It can be the culture of our family, our village, our state, our region, our nation, or the largest grouping for us, Western civilization or Western culture. We could say our culture, for most of us in this room, would also then be Orthodox Christian. These values that we share involve a common history, a common language, common tradition, and our common religion. This is all important, you see, because when you bring the Orthodox faith to North America, you're bringing in something from an Eastern culture into Western culture. It's not Protestant and it's not Catholic, so it doesn't fit most of the cultural norms of anyone except the Orthodox immigrant in the first place. And so when you begin to interact with everybody else, part of that interaction hasn't got anything to do with what you believe as an Orthodox and what they do or don't believe. It has everything to do with all of the other ways we think that are different. And if we're going to have a conversation, and if in fact the world keeps knocking on our door, or the world keeps watching these videos, we need to be aware of sharing the gospel in a larger vocabulary than just 6 feet from us. And so that's part of the reason we're doing this little excursion here this evening. These values that we share involve, as I said, our history and our language and our religion. At the smallest level, a husband and wife begin a personal history with a common language between them. They create a common tradition for the celebration of holidays and agree on a common religion. This husband and wife are part of also their larger families and tribe and share in the common values that they would all share by all. And so on in sharing the values of the region in which one lives and sharing the values of the culture and the civilization in which they find themselves geographically and chronologically. We're debating in this country whether we're a Christian nation or not. And some people, you see, are debating it on one level and another. From a cultural point of view, the West is Christian. That doesn't mean we still are going to behave like Christians or whether we want to remain like Christians. It just means historically, culturally, with the values that we have that heritage coming out of Catholicism and Protestantism that invented Western culture, Western values that we are now either throwing away or accepting or arguing over. These differences of culture are the products of centuries, and they do not soon or quickly disappear. They are far more fundamental. These unexamined things we don't talk about, more fundamental than differences among political ideologies and political regimes that we fight about all the time. Differences do not necessarily mean conflict, and conflict does not necessarily mean violence. However, over the centuries, differences among civilizations have generated the most prolonged and the most violent conflicts, the clash of cultures. When we speak of culture, therefore, we are speaking of being a member of, belonging to, and being shaped by the shared value system that has shaped not only our personal values and our attitudes, but the very ways in which we think. As a member of Western culture, we share in ways we don't recognize a multitude of unexamined presuppositions. These are our cultural heritage, our cultural identity, our cultural givens, the underpinnings we just take for granted because we all believe that. We also must remember that cultural characteristics and differences are less mutable, changeable, modifiable, and hence less compromised and resolved than political and economic differences. In the former Soviet Union, for example, communists can become Democrats. The rich can become poor, and the poor rich. But Russians cannot become Estonians, and the Azeri cannot become Armenians. Political differences can lead to war, but so can religious differences. Political differences are more easily overcome, religious ones not so easily overcome. Civil War vets can make peace. The sons of the North do marry daughters of the South. A person can be half French and half Arab, and simultaneously even a citizen of two countries. It is more difficult, however, to be half Catholic and half Muslim. Stephen P. Huntington, foreign policy aide to President Jimmy Carter and Eaton Professor of the Science of Government and Director of the John M. Olin Institute for Strategic Studies at Harvard University. How's that for a mouthful of credentials? Predicted, with the fall of communism, the removal of the Berlin Wall, and the end of the Cold War, he predicted that future global conflict would be a clash of civilizations, not a fight over political ideology, democracy versus communism. Huntington stated his position in 1993, 8 years before the events of 9/11 proved him right. While this clash of civilizations is ongoing and has occurred ever since 9/11, there is a different clash of culture that has also been going on, not a clash between civilizations, but a clash within our own Western culture. And this is where we're headed on our excursion. The Persian Empire and its culture conquered the empires of Mesopotamia and its cultures, but failed to conquer Greece and its culture. What Persia failed to do in heading west, Alexander the Great did by heading east. He conquered Egypt, the Middle East, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Rather than conquering the cultures of the defeated, Alexander Hellenized them. He synthesized Greek culture, Greek ideas, Greek values, Greek way of thinking, Greek religion. He synthesized it with the other cultures. He intermarried the cultures. Alexander thus introduced the concept of hybrid and hybridization into Greek culture. Eventually, to Alexander's empire, the Persians and the Mesopotamians would break away from Greek control as the Romans began to conquer the Mediterranean world. With the loss of Mesopotamia and Persia, the hybridization of the Roman identity synthesized with the Greek culture and emerged as the Greco-Roman Empire. Constantine's creation of a new Rome, known to us as Constantinople, as the new capital, acknowledged the Greco-Roman identity of the empire. He moved the capital from Rome over to east of Greece, and this was the empire that embraced both cultures together. Constantine accompanied the shift from Rome to New Rome with a shift in religion. The empire became Christian. It is estimated that 20 to 50% of the empire was Christian before the Edict of Milan in 313 granted religious freedom to Christians within the empire. For the next 300 to 400 years, the Greek fathers of the Christian church began the Christianization of Greek philosophical thought and the Christianization of the Greco-Roman Empire. I use the term the hybridization, and I shouldn't have here, so you can write that one out, because what Christianity did was not to create a hybrid. It's going to be the complete rethinking of Greek culture. Some would argue that Western culture itself began with Homer and the recounting of the Trojan War in the Iliad and the Odyssey around 760 BC. Certainly by the time of the Greek playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the pre-Socratic Socrates, and Plato, Aristotle, And then by the time of Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC, Greek culture was in its classical form. If the Christianizing of Greek culture began after the creation of the Greco-Roman Empire by Constantine in 325, with the calling of the First Ecumenical Council of the Christian Church, the Latinizing of Greek culture began after the sack of the city of Rome by Alaric in 410, with the writing of the City of God by Augustine of Hippo. A strong case can be made that Western culture actually began with the Latinization of Greek culture, with Augustine's blueprint for creating a Latinized Christian city, civitas, as opposed to the Greek polis. Now notice, there is a distinction between Christianizing the philosophy of the Greeks, Christianizing Greek philosophy, and Latinizing Greek philosophy. The first one, Christianizing the culture, internally alters, modifies, and transforms the content of Greek philosophy. The Greek fathers abandoned Greek ontology. This led to the overturning, conversion, and baptism of the Greek mind into the radical Christianization of the Hellenic world. At the very basic level of this ontological, the very heart of something, Eastern Christianity is independent of Greek philosophy. Latin Christianity primarily translated Greek philosophy into a different language. There's a difference in translating the terms into a different language and completely revitalizing, redefining, and altering those very terms, no matter what language you're using. That's the point. This distinction between Christianizing philosophy and Latinizing that philosophy ultimately leads to a distinction between Greco-Christianity, the Greek end of the empire Christianity, and Roman Christianity, a distinction that will divide the Greco-Roman Empire into a Greco-East and a Latin West, and the Greek theology of the Eastern Church and the Latin theology, which is philosophy, of the West, which leads eventually to the splitting of the Greek-Roman Empire and the Great Schism of 1054. It existed from the beginning. It's a matter of culture and whether or not you completely Christianize it or whether you just made a hybrid, and if you make a hybrid, the hybrid can pull apart and break. Religion is one of the most unchanging and less easily compromised issues in one's personal and cultural identity. Political, economic, and social differences can lead to a war. Differences in religion have led fathers to disown children and religious communities to divide and split. The same is true within empires. The religious differences within the Greco-Roman Empire not only caused the splitting of Christianity within the empire, it led to a violent clash when the Christian East attacked when the Christian West attacked the Christian East in a series of crusades between 1100 and 1300. In the Fourth Crusade in 1204, giving up all pretense of freeing the Holy Lands from Islamic control, the Crusaders attacked, raped, and pillaged Constantinople. Their ships filled with gold, silver, art, and books. The Crusaders returned to Venice, where, inspired and financed by the treasures of Constantinople, the Italian Renaissance would begin. Among the books brought back to Italy were the writings of the ancient Greek philosophers, especially the writings of Aristotle. Since Augustine, the Latin West had known only the thinking of Plato. Almost 900 years later, Thomas Aquinas introduced Aristotle to the West by using Aristotelian thought to Latin theology. Within 200 years, the Renaissance, with its new Thomistic theology, Thomas Aquinas' Thomistic theology, had spread across Italy, France, and Spain. It was like a new religion. Those north of the Alps were not so quick to embrace the changes, especially the change in the Latin Church from Augustinian theology to the Thomistic theology of Aquinas. In the same way, differences in the use of Greek philosophy had led to the splitting of the Greco-Roman Empire in 1054. The use of the different Greek philosophers, Plato versus Aristotle, now split Latin Christianity as Martin Luther and John Calvin led to the division into Protestant and Catholic. Do you see the picture? Here's a Roman Empire made up of Greek and Roman values together. Christianity comes along, and we're going to begin Christianizing the whole empire until in the West you begin using Latin to do your theology, and you write a book called The City of God, and in it, rather than Christianizing Plato, we just take Plato and translate him into Latin. And you, instead of Christianizing Plato in the West, we Latinized Plato, introduced Plato into the West, and now you've got Greek philosophy, the church in the West, based upon Plato's thinking, Greek philosophy. Then you go, 900 years later, you have a crusade. They attack Constantinople. They bring back the other major Greek philosopher, Aristotle, who was different from Plato. And now you introduce a new way of thinking your Latin Christian theology, now using Aristotle. And so you had a split between East and West, with the Christianizing the empire or Latinizing it. Then we come Italy and West, where it's all Latin. And now we're going to split Latin Christianity between two Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle. I'm wanting you to see the role of religion and the role of philosophy and how it rips cultures apart. It helps us understand the 21st century we're now living in, perhaps. Making use of Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas sought to define the relationship of Greek rational thought with Latin Christian theology. How do I make a hybrid out of Christian theology and Aristotle? And he understood this hybrid approach in terms of philosophy being the servant, the handmaiden of theology. That's how he did it. We'll let theology be supreme, and we'll let philosophy become the handmaiden, the tool that we're going to use to do it. Vladimir Lossky is going to say that the West thought about the revelation by philosophy. The Christian East doesn't think about the revelation. We think by means of the revelation. What a radical difference if... I know, gosh, this is heavy stuff. Philosophy might bristle with the inequality of being called the handmaiden, the servant to theology. But having called philosophy and designated it, Aquinas rescued philosophy as its own entity. You see, the Eastern Church didn't save Greek philosophy. We Christianized it, completely rethought it, revitalized it into something else that was no longer Greek philosophy. The West says philosophy exists, it's important, it's a way of thinking, it's our handmaiden. Once you give in the West a place of a distinct identity to philosophy, every university in the United States that still has humanities classes or philosophy offers the introduction to philosophy, which is the history of philosophy, and it begins with Plato and Aristotle, and in the West comes all the way up till today. The history of philosophy is the history of Western thinking. It is not the history of how people in Greece still think. It is not the history of how the eastern end of the Roman Empire thinks. It is a history of the development, independent thinking in the West, separate from and breaking from the Catholic Church in the process. That break would bring us eventually to the age of enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries in the West, where philosophy now has achieved its complete independence and as a distinct intellectual discipline, totally separate from religion, and especially independent of Latin Christianity, even hostile to Latin Christianity. So much so that philosophy and philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche in 1882 would declare that God is dead, since a deity was no longer necessary to account for the existence of the universe. The conflict between philosophical rationalism, the only way we think, and theology exploded in the 20th century in the United States as a war between faith and science. The 20th century witnessed the large-scale extermination of the sacred at the beginning of the century in the godless Marxist revolution in Christian Russia, and by the close of the century had seen the wholesale extermination of the sacred into the secularization of the West. The war between faith and science was over. Science had won. At the end of the first century, the first decade of the 21st century, Ferdinand Mount stated, "God's long funeral is over." And we are back where we started. 2,000 years of history have melted into the backstory, which nobody reads anymore. We have returned to year AD 0, or rather 0 CE, because we are in the common era now, the years of our Lord having expired. The war between religion and Greek philosophy was over. Philosophy, human rationalism, and science had won. The celebratory glee took little notice of the birth of this new science. Stephen Pinker gave a birth announcement, but failed to notice that it was the birth of a new Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Before the second decade of the 21st century had passed, the conflict within the godless religion of the Enlightenment had divided between the old science of the Enlightenment and the new science of post-Enlightenment. As assuredly as Nietzsche had declared God is dead, new voices began to announce the Enlightenment is dead. 7 years after Pinker's The Blank Slate, 2002, he announced the birth of the new science. Ian McGilchrist, the master and the emissary in 2009, fired a shot across the bow of Pinker's Enlightenment. 2 years later, Pinker responded with the better angels of our nature, why violence has declined in 2011, in his attempt to defend where the Enlightenment had brought us. McGilchrist followed in 2012 with a 10,000-word essay, The Divided Brain and the Search for Meaning. Why are we so unhappy? Pinker, in response to McGilchrist, then published in 2013 an article, Science is Not Your Enemy, an impassioned plea to neglected novelist embattled professors and tenure-less historians. Ian McGilchrist issued his reply in 2013 to Pinker, Science and the Humanities. Ian McGilchrist's reply to Stephen Pinker. By the way, I handed out tonight a handout of both Pinker's article and the article that McGilchrist replied, his reply. His reply is based on the findings and implications of this newfangled thing, the new science. Pinker then encountered with his new book, Enlightenment Now, the Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, published in 2018. McGilchrist replied in 2019 with Ways of Attending, How Our Divided Brain Constructs the World. At the moment, McGilchrist is working on a new book on epistemology and metaphysics. There are no things which will be published by Penguin Books. This is a battle between old science and new science erupting in our midst. We're totally oblivious to it. I'm not blaming us. I'm totally oblivious to this. I don't usually read these kind of scientific stuff. But the battle between old science and new science, as symbolized in the clash between Pinker and McGilchrist going on right now, back and forth, is a clash over the meaning, the loss of meaning in a world created by, according to McGilchrist, only the left side of the brain. According to Pinker, that left side is the Enlightenment, rather than by the leadership of the right side of the brain that new science is now proving to be the case. How is it that the more able mankind becomes to manipulate the world with his scientific knowledge and tools, the less he can perceive any meaning in it, any meaning in the world, and any meaning in life itself. McGilchrist then adds, our increasing ability to manipulate the world does indeed appear somehow connected with its loss of meaning for us. It is encouraging that new science now questions the loss of meaning achieved by the Enlightenment. The question of meaning offered by our right brain explains how we can come to know meaning and therefore have meaning in our lives. But notice, while it is the right brain that attends, pays attention to the whole, and is aware of the presence that simultaneously interpenetrates behind, beyond, and through our physical fingers. Remember last week? It is our right brain that sees between the fingers of the universe, and the right brain that can become aware of the presence. The right brain, however, cannot explain or define that presence, nor can the right brain account for the origin of meaning that the present brings and gives to mankind. What the new science can say is we've got two parts to our brain, and one part sees the physical in front of us, and the other part sees the larger whole that is present and senses the presence of that which is beyond us. It cannot define it. It cannot speculate on it. It's there, and it is aware and makes us aware that there's something beyond our hand, between the fingers. If you say that right side of the brain is worthless, no good, more power to the left side of the brain, then you're saying all we got's a closed-fisted hand. And that's the fight between McGilchrist saying you've got a hand like this and the right can see through it. We don't know what's out there, but we know there's something there, we can see through it. And so that's the fight that's now going on. Only the presence can account for itself. I'm using the word presence. Some of the church fathers do the same. The one who is that which is. I'm trying to have a conversation with the secular people listening and not just use our in-house cultural Orthodox religious terms that they've already filtered out and can't listen to. They've exterminated those terms in their vocabulary. Paul could go to Athens and there was an altar over there to the unknown God. He said, I've come here to tell you about the God you don't know. He used their terms, their altar, to talk about the unseen, invisible presence of the God that is they don't know. We, like Paul, have come to Athens, the center of the intellectual thinking of Western culture, the birthplace of philosophy and rationalism, and we're daring to understand what they're saying so that we then can say, let me tell you about that unknown God you've got an altar to right over there. Let me tell you about the presence that's on the other side of those fingers that your right brain is actually discovering to be there. Ultimately, the question of meaning for our lives personally and for mankind as a whole finds its answer in paradise. The story of the master and the emissary, we touched on that last week, helps us understand right brain, left brain, and how it gives us the capability of knowing both the visible and the invisible. It is, however, the story found in Genesis that paradise has two trees that steps outside the world we know and takes us back to the beginning prior to choosing the tree that we have chosen. If the 20th century was the battle between faith and old science, it now appears the 21st century will be the battle between old science and new science. The handwriting is on the wall. The Enlightenment is dead. At issue is how long the funeral will take. Any celebration of the death of the Enlightenment is not only premature, it is also unaware of the dangers attending to the coming period of darkness. I tell you what, why don't we just stop right there? Everyone's eyes just glazed over. Let's take a break. We're talking about our world, not just us right here. We know where we are right here. We're in Oklahoma City. We're at St. Elijah Church. We know this world you and I are in. But what we don't know is this world, the world of the West that we're also in. It's like being part of Orthodox Russia in 1916. A year before all hell broke loose and 50 million Orthodox Christians are going to be exterminated. When you exterminate the sacred in this world, eventually that world will exterminate anyone still believing in the sacred. Oops, do you get that? You exterminate the sacred in Mother Russia in 1880, 1890, in the early 1900s, and the Bolsheviks can come in, welcomed in, and overnight, having already exterminated the sacred, now exterminate 50 million people because they still believed in the sacred. We cannot hide our heads under the sand like an ostrich and say, I'm okay right here. If 1917 could happen in 2020, we ought to be aware where we are, not just in Oklahoma City, but in Western world. So-called Western Christianity, whether it is or not, it'll never happen here. That's what the church in Russia said in 1916. That's why we have to, it's every now and then take an excursus out of our comfort zone and raise our head up and hopefully don't get it shot off, because the enemy's already out there saying there's only one world, it's the physical world, and there's nothing but the physical, and if you're stupid enough to believe there's anything beyond the physical, you're too stupid to stay alive. Wow. So, I think this is important. I think we've got to know who we are, where we are, and the world, the kind of world you get when you go to that tree that teaches you a system of knowledge based on the physical world. And that's the world we're now in. And if you looked at break, the article by Steven Pinker defending the Enlightenment, his very last sentence on the very last page says we'll only find meaning in the physical world. The handwriting is on the wall. The sacred has been exterminated, and Mount is correct. Not only did Nietzsche announce it in 1882 that God is dead, we've exterminated him in culture, but Mount is totally correct. As far as the West is concerned, the funeral is over. And we are now 9 years past the funeral being over. And the strong fist of the physical world has been raised. Closed. Now we need a break. See you in a bit. Any celebration of the death of the Enlightenment is not only premature, it is also unaware of the dangers attending to the coming period of darkness. The Enlightenment is dead, but it is not buried. Having exterminated the sacred, in its death throes, it will seek to exterminate those who still believe in the sacred. The Enlightenment ultimately offers no light, no meaning, no awareness of the presence. Now, I'm not saying there is not usefulness out of tools, but as a dominant dictator, it has no light. When the lights go out and the darkness prevails, chaos ensues in the darkness. Just turn out all the lights in here and watch us stumble and crash into these tables. The reign of terror accompanied the French Revolution. Kristallnacht announced the coming of the Holocaust. The extermination of the sacred in Mother Russia led to the communists exterminating those still believing in and worshiping the sacred. In 64 AD, Nero martyred Peter and Paul. 50 years later, Domitian, behaving like Nero, embodying the spirit of Nero, was thought by the people to be Nero revived. The resemblance of the persecution by Domitian to that of Nero led the Apostle John to refer to Domitian in apocalyptic code as 666, the mark of the beast, in his revelation. The consonants of Nero Caesar in Greek are N-R-O-N, using alpha English words, N-R-O-N-Q-S-R, which in the Hebrew alphabet equals 666. The consonants of Nero Caesar in Latin are N-R-O-Q-S-R, which in the Hebrew alphabet equals 616. Ancient manuscripts of the book of Revelation, written in Greek, give the number as 666. Other ancient manuscripts of the book of Revelation, written in Latin, give the number as 616. Nero Caesar. When the lights go out and the darkness comes, the darkness always tries to exterminate the life. I find it astonishing that everybody wants to study the book of Revelation and nobody wants to realize we're living the book of Revelation. We'd rather argue over which political party is the beast rather than look and understand where we are in culture and how big the beast is. Not a mere politician, the face of the beast. When the lights go out and the darkness comes, the darkness always tries to exterminate the light. John lived at a time when that was happening, and he says that in his opening to the Gospel of John. And the light came into the world, and the darkness could not conquer it. Let us make one final stop on this day trip excursion we've taken. The week before we began our first session of Paradise Has Two Trees, flying back to Oklahoma City from having taught at a clergy conference of the Diocese of New York and New Jersey, of the OCA jurisdiction, I read an article by Faith Hill, the assistant editor of the Atlantic magazine. You have a copy of that given out to you tonight as well. The title of the article was "They Tried to Start a Church Without God. For a while, it worked. Secular organizers started their own congregations, but to succeed, they need to do a better job of imitating religion." The following was my response. An observation while I was on that plane: there are those today in academic circles and in quasi-churches who accuse St. Irenaeus, Constantine, and the church councils of running, quote, legitimate alt versions of Christianity out of the official fold. But there is more to the story than political power imposing its will on the whole. This article in the Atlantic is about quasi-church types in 21st century America. There is no emperor here. There are no councils in the United States. There are no saints imposing their will. These quasi-types can do their own thing as they wish without legal, political threat. According to the article, alt groups die by themselves. They lack the ingredients that create sustainability. The alt versions of the first century died out not because they were labeled heretical and non-orthodox. They died out because they lacked the internal dynamic necessary for sustainability. When one looks at the three main groups of official versions of Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant, we see different histories of inherent sustainability. The Orthodox Church remains essentially unchanged over 200 years. The Catholic Church has periodically changed over its 1600-year history, beginning with Augustinian theology in the 400s. That was a change. The Catholic version modified itself 1,000 years later with Aquinas. A split inside Western Christianity occurred, led by Luther and Calvin in the 1500s, and the Protestant version was born. And 500 or so years later, after that split, the Catholic Church modified itself yet again in Vatican II in the 1960s, and continues to do so under the present Pope Francis. The Protestants began modifying themselves by creating the social gospel that substituted social worker do-gooderism as a substitute for an original salvific gospel. Began in the 1890s and the early 1900s in the United States. 100 years later, after the social gospel, both Catholic and Protestant churches across Western Europe are increasingly vacant, In the U.S., mainline Protestant parishes are dying. The new prosperity and feel-good gospel of the independent megachurches is barely 50 years old. Arthur Ferdinand Mount analyzes present Western culture in his book, Full Circle. His opening words are, "The long funeral of God is over. The last 2,000 years has become only a backstory that no one reads anymore. It is year 0 AD, or rather 0 CE, the years of our Lord having expired." So what do Catholics, Protestants, and social gospelers and feel-good evangelicals all share? Answer: the loss of transcendence. The sacred has been exterminated in Western culture and in Western religion. Western Christianity, in all its forms, also shares cultural adaptability. In order to attract members, it offers what is politically and culturally correct. No risk of martyrdom there. A little slower than Europe, culturally speaking, the years of our Lord took a little longer to expire in the United States, but expire they have. When the present generation of church attendees dies, vacant former churches will dot the American landscape. In a world that has exterminated the sacred, in a world filled with empty church buildings, the original church, the Orthodox Church, remains standing. It is the church of the martyrs that stands in the face of extermination. At the risk of death, it refuses to bow to the absolute claim of culture. At the risk of martyrdom, it affirms the presence of the sacred in its midst. The alt versions of the first century, or the present versions in the 21st century, did not die, nor Orthodox Christianity survive solely because Constantine and the church councils said so. Orthodox Christianity survived 300 years of martyrdom because of the presence of the sacred in its midst. The Orthodox Church survived 300 years of martyrdom before there was a Constantine, before there were the church councils. Let me say it again. Survived 300 years of martyrdom. It has survived an additional 1,700 more years because the sacred is present in her midst. Orthodox Christianity arrived in the West about 100 years ago. Having survived martyrdom under the Muslim Turks, martyrdom under the Bolsheviks and the Soviets, the church arrived in the West just in time to face martyrdom again. Nietzsche foretold the extermination of the sacred and the death of God in culture. He did not foretell the coming of Orthodox Christianity to offer itself as the body of Christ in culture, to die yet again for the salvation of a godless culture. Western Latin Christianity is caught up in these wars inside Western culture. Orthodox Christianity, which arrived in the West after World War I, has been influenced by Western culture, but has not been a direct target in the battle between faith and science in the 20th century. With the cultural defeat of Western Christianity, all Christianity in the West, whether Western or Eastern, will be exposed to whatever retribution a godless culture imposes on cultural heretics. Culture, clashes between cultures, and wars within cultures are all products and versions of worlds created by the chosen tree. Already the question begs to be asked, who, what, shall deliver us when the world sinks once more into the chaos of the deadly darkness? We shall discuss that answer to that question in part 2, the tree not chosen. I'm going to finish with this. It's about the last 2 or 3 pages in tonight's thing. I didn't look it up. I'm going to summarize this tree of the 5 senses. We've looked at different aspects. I just want to know how to be saved, Deacon Ezra. We've limited it down that we only face one problem. That's the problem. While we're facing this one problem, we're being blindsided by the Bolsheviks. We're being blindsided by the Muslims. We're being blindsided by whatever group wants to. The tree of the senses gets us to look at whatever it wants us to look at. That's the issue. We devote all of our time to, look at that. Of course, the number one seducer in our lives today is the smartphone, the internet, and social media. It interrupts our lives, demands our full attention, consumes our lives and our time. And there's no value judgment, and I skipped all of the issues of things that are now occupying all of our attention in Western culture that Ferdinand Mount brought to our attention. We shared modern examples of seduction, examples that appeal and attract our attention way beyond sexual stuff. The list is as endless as there are people. This sensible tree, sensate tree, uses our 5 senses to seduce us to doing its will. I'm not placing a value judgment on any of these things. I'm only showing us that seduction is not limited to sexuality. Life in a sensate world is sensual because the tree of knowledge itself is based on the senses, sensuality of the bodily senses. The world makes sense because it's based on our senses. It not only makes sense, but because it is sensible, it is also sensible. What we call knowledge is knowledge derived from our 5 senses. What we call knowledge is limited to our ability to sense the physical world. Our attention and our time are given to sensate, sensible pursuits. Our lives are filled with Little League sports, music lessons, dance for our children. There's clubs we belong to. The list goes on and on and on and on. Just whatever we fill up our lives doing. The issue is not moral. The issue is not whether any of these pursuits are evil. They all share one thing in common. They individually and collectively restrict our lives to a visible physical world. They attract, and at the same time, they distract. The sensate dominates our senses. It shouts so loudly we grow deaf to the inaudible. Its bright and flashing lights make us blind to the invisible. We have filled up our senses with all manner of sensual delights. We now think that a human being is nothing more than flesh, possessing the power of sensation for no other purpose than to enjoy this present life. That which we consume now consumes us. This seductive tree is good for food and pleasing to look at, Eve said. More addictive than heroin, the delightfully addictive pleasure of our senses seduces us. We lose track of time, track of life, track of everything else. Nothing else matters. Everything else ceases to exist. Our brain has two hemispheres. The left half thinks it's the whole brain. Our political creed has replaced the Nicene Creed. I believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have reduced life to a physical world with only physical pursuits. The physical, visible, sensible world distracts us from the whole, from the presence invisibly and simultaneously interpenetrated in reality. The physical attracts our attention to itself. It distracts our attention from everything else. By attraction, distraction, it eliminates that which is non-physical from our lives. It eliminates our awareness of the presence. It exterminates the sacred from our lives. We have eliminated the source of meaning and find ourselves hopelessly without purpose. Many years ago, I served on a church staff. Every Friday was my day to visit members in the hospital. On this particular Friday, I visited a man who had cut off several toes in a lawnmower accident. When I entered his room, his foot was heavily bandaged and elevated. In response to the quizzical look on my face, he explained he had been mowing his backyard when the neighbor lady came out her back door in a bikini to go sunbathing. When he turned his head to look, he pulled the lawnmower over his foot and cut off his toes. Comical to us. He was distracted. You see, our senses have a dual function. They attract us, and by doing so, they distract us. Collectively, this sensible world attracts all our attention and distracts us from giving any attention to the non-physical. Over the centuries, the fingers of Western culture have slowly been closing together with the demand of the physical before us, and in our lifetime, they have now fully closed in our culture. We have surrendered to living in a world created by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have forgotten the other tree. We have forgotten the world the other tree creates ever existed, much less that it still exists. You see, paradise has two trees. The serpent only has one. We have chosen the serpent's tree. We have been seduced. Well, we won't meet next week. We won't meet the week after. When we come back, we'll look at the tree of judgment. One more aspect that's there as we are about to wrap up the world that this tree has created, the world we live in. So So God bless you for coming. Thank you for sitting through a tough one tonight.